R Markdown allows us to rerun our analyses quickly, write papers without having to update figures manually, and automatically generate reports. R Markdown is a package that allows us to combine text, code, figures, tables, to produce reports. You can even use R Markdown to create presentation slides, Word documents, PDFs, entire books, websites, and many more. It's super versatile. To get started, we need to create a new project. We learned from last week that by working inside of an R project, we don't have to worry about changing our working directory because the R project file automatically points R to the folder you're working in, and you don't need to assume that your collaborators know how to modify their working directory, because when passing along your files, what you would do is zip up the entire R project folder and send that along in an email. So let's create a new project, file, new project in a new directory, new project, and I'm going to name that directory R Markdown. And I want to create the project as subdirectory of data science. This is the folder that I use for this course. So we have our project folder. You can see here we're in our Markdown folder, and we've got that .rproj file now. And you should have installed the packages for using R Markdown following the instructions in Canvas. If you haven't done that yet, pause the video, install the packages, and come back, because it can take a few minutes and you'll need to restart your RStudio session. So if you're ready, we will create an R Markdown file by selecting File, New File, R Markdown. So on my machine, it's the third option down. You can enter a title. I'll enter Getting Started with R Markdown, and I'll leave the author as is. And for this demonstration, we'll select HTML, but if you were interested in producing a PDF or a Word document, you would select those options. And I'll select OK. And so it opens up this Markdown file, but it hasn't saved it, so I'll go ahead and save it as R Markdown. And now we have this R Markdown file, this .rmd. This generates a basic .rmd document, and we can customize what people often call the front matter. So this is information at the top of the document. So you can see how it automatically entered the title and author, but you can modify this. If you didn't want the date, you can delete it. If you wanted a different output, you can see the different options, but for this demonstration, we'll keep it as an HTML document that we want to render. So let's see an example of the Markdown syntax. If you scroll down, you'll see some nice examples. What I like about it is it's a good refresher when I start a new Markdown document. But you can go ahead and delete everything after these 3 dashes. You want to leave those because that's our Markdown syntax, that this is kind of like the header for the document. Alright, so we can use R Markdown to integrate both text and code. So let's see some text. Something like Markdown is a plain text formatting syntax that allows you to use pretty basic formatting syntax to format a document. So for example, we can use the hashtag followed by a space to format headers. We can use a single asterisk with no space to format italics, double asterisks to format your text in bold. We can include links in the square bracket. And this is the text that you want to appear in the rendered document, and the text inside of the parentheses is the link that you want to direct your users to. We can also create lists. These lists could be bullets, and notice how there's a space in between, right, to designate a different formatting. And we can create numbered lists as well. So let's see an example of this rendered document by selecting the knit icon. And we can start to see some of these formatting options. Notice how the links, the text is displayed, but if I were to select that, I would be directed to the website. Notice how this is distinct from an R script, right? Because we don't need those comment, those hashtags to tell R not to run this code. When we're running code inside of a Markdown file, it recognizes, R understands that this is text and it's formatted using these particular syntax, so it recognizes this. And then it understands that codes are inside of these, what we'll see as code chunks. So let's go into a little more detail. Let's explore population dynamics and I want to bold the portal project using those double asterisk syntax. And let's see how we count, how counts of rodents like this one particular species change through time. And so our goal is to look at this portal data, isolate this species, and understand how population dynamics are changed through time. So we want to load data from the portal project teaching database. So I'm going to include a link, and I'm going to use the link provided in our canvas to paste to eliminate typos. And 2, we want to process that data into population time series. And 3, make some initial visualizations. So R Markdown is based on a format that contains both text and chunks of embedded R code, which makes it easy to create these dynamic documents. We'll use R Markdown for the rest of the semester to submit your weekly coding labs, and you'll upload the rendered document in Canvas each week. So that could be an HTML, that could be a PDF file. R Markdown is a format that's easy to read for humans, and it's easy to convert into other things for computers. So to produce a document, we'll press knit to create the HTML from this R Markdown document. You can also create PDF and Word versions. And for PDFs, you'll need to install Tiny Text. So Markdown is common on a lot of websites, and now that you know what it is, you'll start to recognize it everywhere. A key feature of R Markdown are the R code chunks. So let's insert a code chunk using this icon, or you can Control-Alt-I or Command-Alt-I is the keyboard shortcut. So I'll insert R. Notice how you can insert other languages as well, making R Markdown really useful if you do some things in Python. So let's insert R, and we'll start to see a very basic format of the code chunk. Notice that the chunk is bounded by these 3 back ticks or graves, and they can be found on the same key as the tilde, which is typically in the upper left hand side of your keyboard. Graves are not the same as an apostrophe. I'll enter an apostrophe here so you can see the difference. So that's an apostrophe, and this is a backtick. And so these need to be backticks. What R Markdown allows us to do is to include code to run in the document, and and we can let's do an example. So I'm going to name this code chunk load packages, and you can do that. This designates the language followed by a space and the name of that code chunk. You don't have to name code chunks, but what I like about naming code chunks is that then you can navigate back and forth. This is helpful if your code is especially long. It helps to navigate between chunks in your document. And then inside of the backticks is where you would write your code like you're already getting used to. So let's load dplyr and ggplot2. If you don't have these installed, go ahead and install them. And I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to run this and make sure I have, okay, and it looks like just an information that the following objects are masked from these packages because they have the same function names as these packages that we're loading. So let's see a knit version of this. And if we scroll down, now we see how this text section has really nice formatting. We've got this in bold. This is in italics. We have the link to the data, and we also demonstrating how we're loading the libraries. But this is probably not something that we want to show in the final rendered document. So we can see some of those options that allow us to hide some of this information. To see those options, you can enter a comma, and you'll immediately see the different options for your code chunk. In this example, we want message equals false because that disables these information messages or warning messages from being printed in your final output. So now let's see that output again, and notice how those messages are suppressed. And I'm even going to put another header that this is loading the data. And I can close that. I want to So now let's see an example of different types of chunk options. Let's create another code chunk, and I'll call this load.data. I want message equals false, and another option is cache equals true. There it is. Cache equals true. What this does, it reuses the results of the code chunk in previous knits. And this is important because it saves time when you're recalculating or having to re-download it each time. So this makes your knit faster than if you had to load all of these things every time you knit. So I'm going to create an object called data. I'm going to use the read.csv function, and I'm going to copy and paste the link from our Canvas page to reduce typing and reduce errors. And I want to print out the first few rows of that object. So maybe I'll clean this up a little bit, and this should be data, and this should be load packages. Now let's knit the current document, and we should be able to see we have these nice headers. We're loading the data, and now we're viewing the output of this function head for our data. It's also possible to run code inside of your text. So for example, the data includes, let's say we wanted to count the number of species in our data without having to do a code chunk. We can run code by calling the backtick R. So that's telling that we're running R. This is our code, and we're calling the length function. And inside of the length function, we actually want to call the unique function for our species ID column in our data object. And we want to close that with another backtick. So this is basically saying, okay, give me all the unique species in our data object or data frame, and then count the number. What's the length of the unique species? So what are the number of unique species? And so the data includes, is going to be a number, X number of species. And let's look at how that is rendered. Instead of opening up a new window, what we can do is preview in our viewer pane here. Let's see an example of that. So we can see it here, and sometimes it's a little bit faster. So now we can see the data includes 49 species, and that 49 was a product of this bit of code that we ran inline. So we didn't have to create a code chunk to run this small bit of code. I recommend that if it's a small bit of code like this, then it's fine to run it in line with the text. But once you get into more complicated code, then you'll definitely want to use a code chunk. So let's take a look at an example of a more complex analysis. So let's get the time series of counts for all species. Let's insert our code chunk, and I'm going to call this maybe time series, and in it I want to create an object called time series, And inside of that, I'm going to use this dplyr notation, which we haven't seen before, so it'll look a little different than what you're used to. So these pipes allow me to pull in anything from the previous line without having to retype it again. So I want to bring in data, our data object, into this line, group by species ID by year. So I want to group our data by species ID and year, and then I want to bring our grouped data into a function called summarize, where I'm going to create a variable called count, and inside that variable I'm going to store the length of each of these categories using the n function, which is a counting function. And I want to return the first few rows for our time series object. All right, let's knit. So we're at the analysis. We've got our code chunk. Oh, we have some messages that I want to turn off, and maybe you want to display the result but not the code. So let's see an example of this. Let's go back to our code. We want message equals false, and we want to use another option called echo equals false. So echo equals false lets you show the results of the code chunk without showing the code. So maybe you're producing a report for your advisor and maybe they don't understand R, so there's no need for you to include the R code. Instead, you just want to include the result. So now let's reknit this, and in this section now we don't see the code itself. All right, now let's do one more example by plotting the time series. And I want to insert an R code chunk. I'll call plot. I want message equals false. I want echo equals false. I don't want to show the code. I just want to show the output. And I want cache equals true. So when I'm building on this code, I don't have to rerun all those analyses, making it a little bit faster. So I'm going to call ggplot function on our time series data, and I want to give it aesthetics. The x-axis I want year, and y-axis I want count, and I want line plot, so I need to add a geometry called geomline, and I want to do this for each species. So I want to facet, use something called a facet wrap by our species ID column. And don't worry if this is all new, we'll dive into ggplot in a few weeks. All right, I'm going to reknit, and it doesn't take very long. And now I can see the result of this code chunk. I have no messages, no code, and I'm saving this to make it faster for your future knits if I wanted to continue building on this. So check out the links below. They're great resources to bookmark. I'm always consulting the cheat sheets when I'm coding, and in this week's lab we'll continue working with R Markdown because practice makes progress, and the more you use those coding muscles, the more comfortable and, more importantly, the more confident you'll feel when coding. So I'll see you soon.